Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Isaiah with Therapy Today. Today we have a special guest. We have Andrea here, and she is an LSW who is going to be speaking out about the Payton Shires case. Now, she has a lot of familiarity with the case because she was in the same training program that Payton Shires was and is in the same city as the NYAP where Shires had worked and had even considered applying there. So she's talking about all these different layers and what circumstances led to the conditions that allowed this heinous crime to happen. And so we are very excited to have her today. Andrea, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and so for those of you who are coming into this conversation, maybe haven't seen previous videos about Payton Shires, she was a social worker who raped a 13-year-old client, followed that up by threatening the client's mother with a gun, and ended up receiving a 4-year sentence in prison. And so Andrea is going to talk through some of the facets of that from a clinical side as well as from a legal side as well. And so we're going to dive into that conversation. Before we do, please do like and subscribe. She's also on TikTok at Andy Lynn Evans. The link will be in the description below, so be sure to follow her. And let's dive into this topic now. So Andrea, talk about some of your connection with the Payton Shires case.
Yeah, so what's really interesting is that I actually had not heard about this case until I saw your video, and I was just minding my business, getting ready for my day, and then I was shocked and horrified and was like, how did I miss this? Which a lot of the news that I've been consuming, particularly last fall, was about international events that I'm involved with in activism, so it wasn't really on my radar, and I did not receive any sort of notification or statement from my former program that I was actually in at the same time as Payton. So I was listening to your video and I was like, why does this name sound so familiar? And then I had to call my mom and I was like, girl, oh my gosh, did you know about this? And she's like, of course I did, because she's in the legal field.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, she stays pretty up to date on a lot of criminal proceedings due to her occupation. And it really just kind of blew my mind. And I was looking through my Outlook contacts and graduation lists, and I was like, oh my God, oh my God. So this is really how I found out about it. And of course, I've consumed a decent amount of content on it since. And it's really just gotten my mind kind of churning with everything I know about our education and training coming from the same program, laws and policies in Ohio, and how this entire thing kind of functions together between the universities, the training, the field placements, the licensure, the laws that permit certain levels of practice, and how I think there are so many vulnerable people and vulnerable points in the system that allow things like this to happen.
How did you feel when you heard what she had done and all of that tied up with the organization that she worked for?
The thing is, so like I said, I had considered applying to this organization because they had decent enough reviews. It's kind of like scraping the barrel when you're looking at community mental health positions.
Sure.
And you're like, how exploited do I want to be? How overworked and morally bankrupt do I want to be on a day-to-day basis? And for me, foster care and working with foster youth requires a lot of kind of awareness and sensitivity that I don't think that exists at a cultural baseline. I know a lot of folks in my life who are former foster youth and experienced pretty horrific kind of treatment and abuse. And I've also worked with many client families who have experienced separation, reunification, or, essentially had their children like legally human trafficked out of their care. Wow. And have been involved in kind of cases around this. And so like legal cases. And it's something that I find very troubling. And so when I hear that abuse is taking place from a person in power in one of these organizations that works with an incredibly vulnerable population, it ultimately doesn't surprise me because, again, not only do I know this from like personal experience, professional experience, but like academic research supports that foster youth are incredibly vulnerable at any point in their, experience, whether that's during or after reunification and they're receiving services. And it's just a very vulnerable group of folks.
So it was kind of sadly unsurprising for you that something like this would happen given what you had seen in the system. And what I understood was that NYAP works specifically with youth in the foster system.
Yeah.
You kind of alluded to this already, but talk a little more in detail. What kinds of conditions made this possible, and maybe how can we prevent some of this in the future?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many reasons I think this is, made possible. And I am somebody, again, this might just be my training in social work and sociology, right? Like coming through here, taking this kind of systemic kind of view of the situation. I think it's really hard for me to look at any individual person like Payton Shires and say it is just some sort of aberration of psychology, which also it's not statistically, right? We live in a culture of abuse. And if we are uncritical about these kind of systems, things slip through the cracks because it's normal. It's the water that we swim in many ways. And this is very apparent to me in the entire foster care system. How we police families, the demographics of those families, who is worthy, who is unworthy, who gets to have their child taken away, who doesn't. So there's that whole aspect, which I kind of talked about in the vulnerability of this population. And also at like a foundational educational and training level, again, having attended the same program, there's inconsistencies in the education at a fundamental level. So Peyton and I both went to the Ohio State undergraduate social work program. We were a year apart, but had overlap, right? And it was always very interesting to me going through this education and training as somebody who came to the field having worked as a paraprofessional in the field prior to this, with a little bit more insight and awareness of what the field is like versus what we're being told and how we're instructed to practice. And I think one kind of unfortunate thing about Ohio State in this regard is that it really tries to be cutting edge in offering science social work degrees.
Okay.
And it's a really large program, and there is not consistency in who is providing the education and training. So there's a lot of adjunct professors. There's not a lot of faculty. I would be in, let's say, I think the most glaring example of this inconsistency is when I would correspond with folks who were in my honors research program about their classes and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, right? And say that they had a wildly different experience that was re-traumatizing for them, or was just full of microaggressions. And I was I'm having the chillest time. Everybody is so respectful and open, and the instructor has good boundaries. And that was the exception rather than the rule, right? And so there's also adjunct professors, community lecturers coming in from different kind of aspects of the work, whether that's micro, meso, or macro work. And the populations that they work with really dictate how they are going to instruct people. For instance, while I think one of my professors who does a lot of work in sex offender and domestic violence, prevention and actually treatment, and does her job really well, right? And I respect her immensely. The kind of toughness that she has to show up with for that work to be safe in many ways really comes through in how she instructs everybody in this kind of very rigid and fear-based way that creates a lot of dissonance, right? And so there's just these little discrepant parts of our education in this program. And there is no real through line or consistency, even though I do think this program is run far better and is more consistent than the MSW program, which is a whole other issue.
Okay.
One thing, since the kind of diagnosis of borderline has been brought up in the Payton Shires case, right? This is something that I think by and large, most mental health training programs really drop the ball on. And what I mean by that is that I have been in borderline recovery since I was almost 18 years old. And I am 32 this weekend. Happy birthday to me. Didn't die. Great job. Bare minimum. proud of myself. But, you know, like sitting in these classes as somebody with this diagnosis and hearing the abject kind of dehumanization of folks with borderline, the stigma that is delivered with the education that is unethical, right? It doesn't align with our ethics and social work to promote the dignity and worth of everybody, and to care and advocate for everyone, right? It is such an alienating experience, right? And the way we talk about folks with borderline and any other cluster B disorder, honestly, like narcissism has been done real dirty in recent years. Yes. It's just been distorted to mean like evil, toxic abuser disorder. And I'm like, okay, whoa, how did we get here? Also, is this something we should be saying as an educational institution that shapes the minds of future practitioners, right? Yeah. The stigma that exists in these spaces, or even generally, prevents people who already fundamentally lack insight into their condition, right? It's an egocentric condition shaped by relational trauma and characterized by like big behaviors, impulsivity, and like really diffuse boundaries, a really compromised sense of self and other, right? When we create this boogeyman, people don't identify with the boogeyman.
Of course.
And if the professors and instructors are believing that borderline only looks one certain way, such as potentially ended up being in this case, right? Like we don't know if this is a confirmed diagnosis for her, but there's nothing that can be done to prevent it, because what is in front of them in the class, that is potentially a class that is saying all borderlines are manipulative, not even calling them people with borderline, not helping people who are going to be working with folks with borderline understand what it is. It also prevents people from being able to identify or be open about their needs for support and accommodation and potentially extra supervision around the provision of care. And so it's just this like kind of enduring poison in the mental health space in general. But I think even as somebody who is in long-term recovery, right, I really struggle with not feeling isolated, alone, and alienated, and feeling like I can actually talk about how I relate to this profession, what I might need in terms of support, how to advocate for myself in my field placement, how to get hooked up with counseling services. If I was not deep in recovery and found myself needing that at a vulnerable time, like such as Payton is in her early 20s, I'm in my early 30s, right? Yeah. That's really concerning to me. And I think this also factors into why these harms can happen, because we've seen it time and time again. Somebody with a personality issue enters the field and they're in a position of power and they don't manage their behavior and the relationship in a way that's like safe, and even worse, can be incredibly harmful for others.
I think you've kind of set the stage really well for some of these factors that begin at the undergraduate level, going through the graduate and even through like different placements level. What comes to mind for myself, and probably what a lot of people will think as they're hearing all of this, is, well, you all were probably all taught not to sleep with your clients, and everyone knows not to rape in general, but also not rape underage, especially clients. But like this is all like degrees of complete inappropriateness, right? And so they say, like, how do you separate kind of the circumstantial factors that maybe set the stage, but that she also made the choice also to abuse her power and her position of privilege?
Yeah, and this is where I think I generally am going to try to, if anybody does follow me on TikTok, you'll hear me say this all the time, inject some nuance into the discussion, right? And so what's really interesting to me to kind of consider when I think about who abuses children, right? That is not a monolithic kind of like interpretation that we can make. We can't say this type of person with this specific issue abuses children, right? By and large, people who sexually abuse children are not actually attracted to children. And I think this is a hard pill for people to swallow, but if we think about it in the paradigm of abuse of being power over based on coercive control, and then we kind of factor in any number of systemic factors like power granted to you by the state through your licensure, that's one aspect of power over. And Then we also have to consider, right, like, is this person actually attracted to children, or do they just want power over? Or also, and this could be and or, honestly, it's very complex, right? Who the kind of psychology and privileges of people who harm children. Is there something in their experience, were they sexually abused? Because we know that people who sexually abuse have generally been sexually abused at a critical point in their development, right? And this doesn't excuse the harm that they've done by any means. So I always want to be very clear about this. We have to understand the problem to address the problem, right? Not all people who are sexually abused will grow up to sexually abuse others. Some people will actually be like horrified that they would ever, perpetrate. And also, in an equally kind of unhealthy way, some people who are sexually abused will become vigilantes in moments like this, when they see their experience still happening, right? And they will go after the individual person who at one point was also a victim. But, even within these kind of experiences, when people are abused or sexually abused and go on to either be attracted to minors or have really kind of taboo or unacceptable social fantasies or paraphilias, right? There is still individual psychology, right? And I think so often we hone in on that in like this kind of cartoony, stigmatized way that still seeks to find the actual devil incarnate. And I don't know if that's necessarily helpful. In this case, when we're throwing around this kind of, diagnosis of borderline, that's what's being spoken about. What I know about borderline from my academic understanding, I want to be very clear, this is not my understanding of myself, right? There is this thing that in more psychodynamic models we refer to as borderline personality organization. And this is something that literature supports being kind of inherent in many people who abuse. Some people would say it's like because they want to harm other people, or they want complete and total domination of people. And that might not necessarily be the full picture or even part of the picture at many points. For this thing called borderline personality organization, there is this diffuse sense of self and other in which the other is or can be an object, right? And it can be treated as an object and not be seen as a human. And generally speaking, people who develop this kind of borderline personality organization have been violated and intruded upon. And they remain kind of developmentally stuck in many ways. Sorry about that. If you can hear that, he's got things to say. He doesn't agree. I have diagnosed him with borderline. If anyone is interested, he takes meds. This confusion of self and other, in which another person can become an object and can then become this kind of way to reenact one's own kind of experience or harm, or reclaim some sort of power over, or regress into a state where they maybe don't even view this person as necessarily different. Like they are this child. There's a lot of things that can kind of happen, and I'm not saying this is what's happening in this case, but it is so complex in so many ways. And I think when we are talking about the behaviors of accusing people of ruining your life, threatening them with violence, when we see this again, you are the problem for me, and I can only reconcile this and in an impulsive way that takes both you and me out.
I see. It
shows that there's this lack of understanding of where self kind of ends and other begins, and how human the other is, and how human maybe even the person is.
Sure.
Because if we're talking about things like borderline, right? People with borderline have no base. Right. Particularly if you're on this like severe end where you would potentially be engaging in these behaviors. It's interesting to consider this as a choice rather than a series of reactions based on prior conditioning, right? That kind of impulsivity, that kind of decision-making capacity is not necessarily online, right? That can often come across as, really unsatisfying for victims,
Sure.
right? I think many of us know the experience of parents lacking insight and saying the wildest, most hurtful things, unfortunately, and not seeming to have the capacity to develop that insight because it's deeply ingrained in their kind of psychology and body. It doesn't erase the harm done, but again, I'm saying if we can't name the problem or be really curious about all of those moving parts in the system, in the environment, in the person, then we don't have a great chance of actually addressing and changing it to prevent harm.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to reiterate, I think you're not necessarily implying that all of these processes are taking place in this particular case, but just like in a general sense, this could be what's contributing to the problem. And I think, like you talked about, sometimes it does feel unsatisfying, especially for policymakers or people, maybe the hiring people over at the organization that she worked at. And, I think I heard that they were being slapped with a lawsuit as well. Is there any...
Which, they should be.
Yeah.
If this is the system, right? Get your dues.
Which, is there any way to be able to prevent somebody who may have come up through that system and maybe has some of these preconditions that you talked about met, who might act in a way that's harmful in their position of power?
Yeah, I think people are really uncomfortable with gatekeeping on all systems levels, right? I think, again, Ohio State's social work programs are very large. So for context, I think the undergraduate program is about 350 students.
Wow. Yeah.
And Ohio State is one of the biggest universities in the country, right? And so this is its own college. So if you're like, well, it's a whole college, it doesn't sound so bad. But when you consider, again, that there is not tremendous oversight or consistency, particularly since this was also during COVID. So I'm not sure exactly when, again, since there was a year between us, I don't know how much of Payton's education was online out of necessity, but for pretty much all of the classes, there is an online option where you don't ever have to engage with anybody in face-to-face interaction. And I think there's also, unfortunately, the vast majority of instructors are just pretty nice white ladies who don't like to rock the boat and might be socialized to be more passive and indirect and this I don't know. I always kind of refer to it as kumbaya, everybody has a place, which is true. And that's a great strategy if the field has a history of gatekeeping low income, disabled, people of color, queer people. But when it comes to the amount of oversight and insight they actually have into any individual student and their psychology and their behavior, it's just not there. And again, there's no kind of consistency outside of these kind of core courses that are mainly done by the limited PhD faculty, right? So those are going to be more of the research and statistics courses.
Sure.
And then everything else is kind of fielded to adjuncts or community lecturers. There have been times when, again, I've been dealing with some sort of medical situation and I go to request an incomplete and the lecturer has no clue what that is or how to do that. And there's no kind of cohesion there or even baseline understanding of how to have this kind of cohesive educational experience. So the fact that people slip through the cracks here doesn't surprise me. In my experience, there was one person who was gatekept openly in front of other folks in many ways, not the final process, but she no longer showed up because it was very clear based on interactions in our kind of role play groups and in the class that this was not going to be a good profession for her. And if she was making people this uncomfortable in these role plays, being alone with a client was potentially going to be very harmful. Again, there is some gatekeeping, there is some oversight, but a lot of that is so spread out and lacks any sort of network to manage it And then a lot of the kind of onus gets put on the field practicum kind of team. So the coordinator, the liaison, the actual supervisors in the field placements. And I think they get a lot more face time with the interns. But again, that also requires that these agencies and programs are also ethical and are also like minding their P's and Q's in many ways and aren't uncomfortable with confrontation and saying, I'm concerned about your behavior, or I've noticed that you're struggling with this and I'm curious if you have like therapeutic support, like what's your support network like? Like I can't be your therapist, but I think you might need to see a therapist and I'm going to have to talk to your program about this. Like gone are the days in which we actually require therapy for students in most programs. And there's a pros side to that and there's a con side to that. And I think the con side to that is that this really does not have the proper attention that it requires.
Okay. So you see a lot of it as self-perpetuating at this point. Final question that I have is that you mentioned that you made some kind of professional sacrifices to hold yourself to a higher standard, obviously seeing a lot of the challenges in place at the collegiate and graduate level as well as at the field placement level. What does that journey look like for you?
So as I mentioned in our kind of exchanges prior to this, I am a very morally scrupulous person, and that can translate to the unrelenting standards for myself and others kind of schema. It's a work in progress, right? But, you know, I think if I'm in a profession where I am pretty ethically scrupulous, that is a safer choice than not. For me, going through the Bachelor's of Science of Social Work program at Ohio State, I felt prepared to be better than my MSW program, which I ended up dropping out of. And I will be going to a much smaller couples and family therapy program that is far more comprehensive and has just ample oversight. It has I think, student to faculty ratio of like 2-to-1 or 3-to-1, which is fantastic. Costs an arm and a leg, but you know, I already threw a bunch of money down the drain in my last graduate program and I'm still in state, so it works out. I think the troublesome thing for me in all of this is the lack of cohesion in programs, lack of consistency, lack of oversight, and because I am so worried about harming people, as somebody who has been harmed in life and within the context of social work and therapy relationships at a vulnerable point and a vulnerable age. I am so sensitive to it that I felt like, one, being able to practice as a psychotherapist under supervision at an agency at a bachelor's level, even though I personally take that very seriously and received a lot of additional kind of training, getting certified in DBT skills, doing a lot of like IFS education and training, and making sure that I was honest with my supervisors, right? And had support outside of work. Like, not everybody's like that.
Sure.
Not everybody comes to this profession as if it is a life path or a calling, right? For some people, it is in fact a job, and it's just crossing the T's and dotting the I's and getting into the field as fast as possible. And unfortunately, the programs enable that, and the laws and policies enable that. And so when I hear folks talking about this case saying, well, presumably she just graduated with her master's, I was like, nope, absolutely not. But I can tell you also, the Master's of Social Work program is no better. I've had people in my life who are in like kind of related fields, or switched out of this program, basically refer to it as a money mill, because it's a high volume of students. It's an advanced standing program, and it just churns people out while burning them out in the process. And so there's no time to actually really take in what you're learning and learn how to do it in a safe and supported way. The students are really stressed. The staff are really stressed. A lot of things fall through the cracks. And I could sense myself not falling through the cracks in a way that I would worry about practice, but in a way that, as somebody, again, with borderline who struggles with my health in many ways, the accommodations that I required to participate were not honored. They were kind of viewed as a suggestion and not a federal law. So the kind of irony that I was sitting in my supervision and HR class learning about these federal protections in educational institutions and just being like, the dissonance is getting a little too dissonant. I fear I am going to have a mental breakdown. I'm actually just going to leave, and I don't know if I'm going to come back. And that's just not how education and training should be. And it makes me really sad because I feel like folks are entering the field without the energy at a physical level to even have the resources to engage with clients in a safe and compassionate, ethical manner. And there's so much kind of just, oh, well, you'll figure it out. I'm like, well, that depends on a lot of factors. It becomes, again, this like individualist thing in a program that teaches us to operate from a very complex systems informed level. And I think that is just a factory for bad practitioners, or not necessarily even practitioners that would have been harmful or unethical or, you know, too burnt out that they were like incompetent, right? Under the circumstances, it just kind of broke them. And there are many people I know who graduated and immediately went into the field looking down the barrel of all the loan debt, right?
Yeah.
And have had to quit and go on disability because they were just too like sucked dry by the entire experience. And that's unfortunate. And so while that master's experience was not the BSSW program that, you know, Payton and I had some overlap in, it's just concerning nonetheless. And it really bums me out. And I think, unfortunately, the kind of hazing ritual of these programs actually gatekeeps a lot of folks, you know, who are struggling to get their accommodations, who take this kind of job as a calling very seriously, and just want to do their best, but need different things. These are the people that end up getting gatekept. It's the people who struggle with their health, or have, you know, even been in recovery for, you know, pretty serious mental health conditions, you know, and still, because of the nature of what it takes to manage these conditions and how susceptible they are to like the environment, when the environment is just like up to here, toxic stress, right? They end up not being able to either graduate or get into the work without needing some substantial sort of like rest and care that comes at a time when they can't really afford it. And I just don't think that's how these things should be going. And I think there's a lot of things we need to reckon with as a professional and these kind of educational and training institutions.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. So it sounds like you were in a position where you could take some extra time, spend more money to be in a program that would actually provide the quality of education and allow yourself to really pour yourself into this in a way that was safe and healthy for you.
Because that makes a safe and healthy practitioner.
Absolutely. But unfortunately, like you're saying, that's not the case for everybody where they have the opportunity to be able to do that. So thank you so much for sharing some of your thoughts and some of your experiences. It is a hard topic to talk about because we do put a lot of trust in therapists. And like you're talking about, there are a lot of conditions that are not ideal for some of these practitioners just getting out into the field. So thank you for bringing light to some of that. For all of you who are watching, want to give a big shout out to Andrea for sharing her insights today. Again, check her out on TikTok at Andy Lynn Evans, and we will see you all next time. Thank you so much for watching.